Hello everyone, welcome to my November 2018 haul video. Welcome back everyone to a new haul video. This is once again up much later than I originally anticipated, so I apologize for that. But this video is going to be kind of a combination of several different things that I did in the month of November. First up, of course, is the regular month of picking up movies and all that kind of stuff, the usual things that you're used to seeing. Next up is I had my local Comic-Con that happened as well. In the very first weekend of the month, the local Rhode Island Comic-Con happened, so I picked up a few things from there. And of course, there was also the Criterion sale that happens at Barnes & Noble twice a year, once in July and another time in November. So I picked up a bunch of things from that sale as well. So without further ado, let's get into all the things I picked up at the local Comic-Con. And first up here are a bunch of mini posters similar to what I picked up last year. It's actually from the same exact vendor that I picked up all of the posters from last year. I picked up posters also the year before from him as well, so it's kind of a recurring thing where I spend a lot of time at his booth during my time there at this con. First up here is the poster for The Thing, the famous film from John Carpenter, which is a remake. So if there's anybody out there who says, you know, the originals are always better than the remake, you can definitely point to this film because this is definitely the exception to that rule. Next up here is the film of Horror of Dracula, which is the first Hammer horror Dracula film starring the late great Christopher Lee. There was a series of Dracula films that they did with Hammer Horror. If you're into Hammer horror films, definitely check out the Frankenstein films and the Dracula films that they did. They are a lot of fun. Next up here is the original poster for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I absolutely love this film, unashamedly. It's one of my favorite all-time movies. I watched it so many times as a kid, and I can quote this movie for absolute days. The film came out in 1990, which was quite a long time ago, and for me, this is the best live-action film that they ever did. Next up here is a poster for a silent film that unfortunately doesn't exist really in any video footage form. The only way you can actually watch this film is it's done via still photos from what the film would look like, and there's also a bunch of title cards that connect all of the photos and the story together. And the reason why I like this poster so much and picked it up is because it's a film that stars the great Lon Chaney. And if you can see in there, you can see his character. Lon Chaney was known for having just fantastic makeup effects put on him to really create these amazing creatures. Next up here is another film similar to that era, and that is Todd Browning's Freaks. This film was very controversial when it came out. This film is a film that I hope gets a Blu-ray release very soon, whether it be Criterion or someone else. It's a great film. I definitely check out Todd Browning's work. Last but certainly not least is the poster for the original King Kong film from the 1930s, the one that was done with amazing stop-motion visual effects, and I really love this film. I think the effects do really hold up. Next up are the comic book related items that I picked up at Rhode Island Comic-Con. First up here are 3 volumes from a local writer who just signed a deal with Dark Horse to compile all of these volumes into one giant omnibus and also to produce new material for Dark Horse. So that writer is Jenny Wood, and her comic book is Flutter. First up here is Flutter Volume 1, and as you can see here, they are in plastic, and she was nice enough to autograph these things personally for me, so that was kind of cool. Next up here is Flutter Volume 2. Next up here is Flutter Volume 3. And Flutter is an LGBTQ comic. Definitely do some research on it. If you can still find these volumes, get them. If you can't find them because they are now out of print, then definitely look into getting the omnibus, because I know that that has already been released. I will also be putting all of her social media contacts below, so please check those out as well. For those of you that have been following my recent haul videos, you'll know that I have been collecting the individual issues for the most recent run of Supergirl that is being written by Mark Andreyko. And while I was at the con, I realized that I was missing a specific issue, and that was issue number 23, and I just happened to find it while I was there. And as you can see here, it has a very cool, almost holographic cover. I think that that was something they were specifically doing for the week that this issue was coming out. I was also able to make my way over to one of the vendors that were selling graphic novels and trade paperbacks and hardcovers and omnibuses and all stuff like that. So I picked up a couple that I was missing and I wanted to get into my collection. The first one up here is the second volume of the New 52 run of Superman that was written by Dan Jurgens. I specifically been wanting to get this because they are starting to go out of print, and I really don't want to start having to pay collector's prices on eBay for these. Next up here is the Volume 2 of Guardians of the Galaxy that was written by Brian Michael Bendis quite a few years ago. This, I believe, is the run that is a big inspiration for the movies. I could be wrong on that, so don't quote me, but I believe that that is the case. And last up here is Volume 2 of an Avengers run that was done many, many years ago, coincidentally also by Brian Michael Bendis. So that ends all the things that I picked up at Rhode Island Comic Con this year. Next up are a group of also comic book related things that I picked up separately to that. First up here is issue number 1 of Firefly, which is now being put out by Boom Studios. I believe I mentioned that Firefly had been bought by Boom Studios, so they were going to start releasing their own comic book, and this is their first issue. Coincidentally, I still have to read all of the stuff that was put out by Dark Horse quite a few years ago. Next up here is a bit of a big release for me. If you've been watching these videos all along, you know that I've been picking up the individual issues for Mr. Miracle, written by Tom King and drawn by Mitch Gerads. This is now issue number 12, so this maxi series is now complete. This is the final issue. I believe the trade is going to be coming out within the next couple of months. I'm not quite sure of the exact date, but if you haven't been able to get these individually, definitely plan on to get the trade when it comes out, because this was just a fantastic read. I really enjoyed it a lot, and I highly recommend it. And last up here kind of goes along with the Superman trade that I got, and that is the hardcover version of Batman Volume 1, The Court of Owls, which of course was from the New 52 from a few years ago. I was very lucky to find this still shrink-wrapped, still in stores, brand new, because like I said, a lot of these are going out of print, and especially for this run from Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo, this was a fantastic run of the character. I read many of the issues individually. They wrote about 50 issues in this run, and it's really fantastic. I highly recommend getting this and reading this any way you can. Next up, let's go with all the things I picked up on Black Friday. Black Friday this year was an interesting year for Black Friday. This was really the first main year where UHD 4Ks were heavily marked down. Last year, a lot of them were still rather expensive, and there weren't a lot of titles to choose from. This year, there was so much more. So first up here, I have Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas, the one starring Jim Carrey, directed by Ron Howard. I know this isn't a favorite for many people, but it's kind of a guilty pleasure slash favorite for me. I really just love the physical comedy of Jim Carrey. His facial features in this film are just great. The makeup effects are great. The set design, the art direction of this movie I think is great. And the movie itself is just a wild interpretation of the classic story of the Grinch and Christmas and all that kind of stuff. Next up here is another film that is not much beloved by many people, but it's not a film that I think is terrible, and that is Justice League in 4K UHD. This I rebought because I'm starting to rebuy pretty much all of the superhero stuff in UHD 4K because they really do benefit from the upgrade. This film, maybe not so much so, because if you're familiar with the history of it, there was a lot of CGI problems when it came to the finished product. Next up was a film that desperately needed a remaster when it came to Blu-ray or 4K or whatever, and that is American Psycho. Of course, starring Christian Bale. This film for me is a dark horror comedy that's a social satire about the 1980s, and it's one of my all-time favorites. And I'm happy to say that it now looks much, much better than the original Blu-ray release, which is one of the worst Blu-rays that you could ever find when it came to picture quality. Next up here is coincidentally another Ron Howard film, and that is Apollo 13 in 4K UHD. If you're not familiar with my love for Apollo 13, well, I'm expressing it now. I bought this movie on DVD. I bought it twice in Blu-ray, and I'm buying it once again in 4K. I don't know what it is about this movie. I just really love it a lot. I've always been fascinated with NASA and space exploration and the Apollo program and all that kind of stuff. Next up here is a Peter Jackson film, and that is King Kong, the Ultimate Edition. This is, of course, another 4K UHD, and this is a huge upgrade from the Blu-ray that came out a few years ago, which was also remastered in 4K. Next up is Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, and I know this film is not really great. I don't think it's terrible. I do think it is visually striking, though, and that's kind of why I bought this release. The next three things I have are just regular Blu-ray releases. First up here is just one of the most delightful and best films of 2018 or 2017, depending on where you were in the world when it was released, and that is Paddington 2. If you're not familiar with Paddington and Paddington 2, make yourself aware of these movies because they're so darn delightful. They're both for adults and children. I think can get a lot out of them, and it's just a wonderful, heartwarming character going on just wonderful adventures. I can't recommend this enough. The next up here is the DC Universe movie, The Death of Superman. If you're not familiar with what they're doing now with this film, is they're doing The Death of Superman, and then their next one, which would probably be The Return of Superman. This is, of course, the famous story arc that they are adapting from the 1990s, where Superman fought Doomsday, died, and then had to come back, and all kind of stuff like that. Coincidentally, they already did a Doomsday movie, which I think was one of their first ever DC animated films, but now they're redoing it and making it more of a faithful adaptation to the comic book. Next up here is probably one of the most ambitious animated films you'll see from DC, and that is Batman Ninja. Do yourself a favor and watch this with the original Japanese voiceover, because that is the way to watch this movie. The American English audio is not great, and also it takes away a lot from what this film is trying to do. This film is absolutely bonkers. It's like an anime meets DC characters with Batman and the Joker and Robin and all that kind of stuff, and I ended up really liking it. You just kind of have to strap yourself in and go on a roller coaster ride with it. Last but certainly not least are all of the things I picked up at the Criterion sale at Barnes & Noble. I only picked up 7 individual releases this time and one gigantic release, which I'm going to be doing a much more in-depth video on, but hold on for that. So let's dive into these first. First up here is a film that once was announced to be released by Criterion on Blu-ray. I kinda cried, and that is Orson Welles' Magnificent Ambersons. If you are aware of my love for Orson Welles, or if you have a love for Orson Welles yourself, you understand the importance of this movie and the bittersweetness that goes into this movie. There's a very interesting history behind this film, but once again, I'm really glad to add more Orson Welles on Blu-ray to the collection. Next up here is an all-time classic, a fan favorite for many, many people, and that is Rob Reiner's The Princess Bride. As you can see here, it is done in a book-style packaging, a hardcover book-style packaging, with, of course, the booklet being the pages of the book. Next up here is an upgrade from a Blu-ray I already have, and it's a much-needed upgrade, and that is Tree of Life by Terrence Malick. This film is art house glory, really at its highest point. It's a film that in its original theatrical cut I thought was fantastic, and I know there's a much longer director's cut that I can't wait to watch for the first time, because it's going to be like looking at an entirely new film. Next up is another film by another master, and that is Andrei Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev. I've been wanting to watch this movie for years, but I've been waiting and waiting and waiting for it to come out on Blu-ray, because I know it was only available on DVD, and I heard the DVD didn't look that good. So I was waiting, and finally my patience have paid off. Next up is a film that is known for ending the career of Michael Cimino, who directed The Dare Hunter, and that is Heaven's Gate. This has been available for years on Blu-ray from Criterion, and I've been wavering back and forth whether to get it or not. The reason why this movie is so well known is because of all of its production problems and how much over budget Michael Cimino went, and the film's runtime is 216 minutes long, so you can assume how elaborate and how much money it took to make this movie. Next up is Hal Ashby's Shampoo, which is a film that was available on DVD for years, but has now been given a Blu-ray release. I think that Criterion has been re-releasing a bunch of Hal Ashby movies, and I'm glad to keep adding them to the collection, because I still think that Hal Ashby is one of the most underrated directors. He had a great run in the 1970s into the 1980s, and he just doesn't get enough love or enough credit. And finally, here is Ernst Lubitsch's Heaven Can Wait. This is a lush, Technicolor, kind of dreamlike film, and I really enjoyed it a lot when I watched it on the sadly now defunct Filmstruck streaming service. So if you're a big fan of Ernst Lubitsch, or you're just trying to get into Ernst Lubitsch, definitely check out his films that are available from Criterion. And finally, we've come to the end, the final thing I have to show you, and this is something that is just almost too difficult to describe with words, and that is the Ingmar Bergman Cinema Blu-ray box set from Criterion. I've already done an in-depth review of this box set, going inside and out, how the content is laid out, and all kind of stuff like that. Please check out that video that is now up on my channel. So that has been my November 2018 haul video. If there's anything you want to see in more depth, please let me know. I will either comment below with you, or I will do an individual review on that specific item. And once again, if you like this video, please check out the other videos on my channel.